All right, so for our last presentation of the day, we're going to, as I said before, we're going to switch to something completely different because, well, for a couple of reasons. Number one, very, very interesting topic. Number two, there are things happening today like right now today, in terms of particularly determining brain death that are really very, very interesting. Very scary, but very, very interesting. So, you know, want you to be aware of that as well. So, determining brain death and organ donation. So, I'd like to start off with a little quote from someone who we've heard from before today, Pope John Paul II. And this, again, comes from his 1985 encyclical Evangelium Vitae, or The Gift of Life. And Pope John Paul II says this: "There's an everyday heroism made up of gestures of sharing, big or small, which build up an authentic culture of life. A particularly praiseworthy example of such gestures is the donation of organs, performed in an ethically acceptable manner with a view to offering a chance of health and even of life itself to the sick who sometimes have no other hope." All right? So it's a nice kind of introductory quote from John Paul II talking about, you know what, organ donation, this can be a very good thing, as long as, well, he doesn't say it here, he says it in other places, as long as it is done correctly, right? So this is a shortened version of a much longer presentation, and there's 4 parts to it. I'm not gonna go through everything in all 4 parts because we don't have time to do that, but I'm just gonna hit the highlights. And in part 1, I'd like to talk about 4 things very, very quickly, or maybe not so very quickly. One is how we understand how we determine death theologically, how we understand it medically, legally, an evaluation of the neurological criteria for brain death from Catholic teaching, and then give you a couple cases that may challenge this neurological criteria. So theologically speaking, how do we understand death? And very simply and very quickly, death is the separation of the soul from the body, right? That's what it is, right? When our soul separates from our body, that is when we die. Now, certainly from the Catholic Christian perspective, we believe our soul separates from our body, and then at the last day, at the last resurrection, our bodies will be resurrected, just as Jesus's was, and we will spend eternity either upstairs or downstairs, you know, as a body-soul union. All right, but that's getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. All right, body-soul separation, that comes right from the Catechism. John Paul II spoke about it, and we're going to see some quotes from his 2000 address to the Transplantation Society. It's a big, long name, but essentially doctors who are doing transplants. And John Paul II says this: "What is death? The death of the person is a single event consisting in the total disintegration of that unitary and integrated whole." All right, so we are human organisms, right? We're made up of different systems, different parts that work together for the integrated whole. And what John Paul II is going to say is one way we can understand death is when a disintegration of all of that happens. All right? Right now we're all integrated, except for me. I got some disintegration up there. All right? But death is the total disintegration of that within us. That is the personal self. It results from the separation of the life principle, or soul, from the corporal reality of the body of the person. And this next bullet point is very important. The death of the person, understood in this primary sense, is an event which no scientific technique or empirical method can identify directly. Right? If death is the soul leaving the body, right, and the soul is beyond the physical, right, there's no objective measure, George, unless you know one, there's no objective measure that I know of, I don't think anybody else knows of, that demonstrates when the soul leaves the body. You can't prove it physically, right? So John Paul II, he's recognizing, he's not recognizing this, he's saying, listen, you know, when we're talking about death and determining death, we've got to be very careful when we do it, right? Got to be very, very careful because there's no objective, medical, scientific way to determine exactly when the person dies, right? Keep that in mind. All right, how about medical and legal? And I'm being very, very brief here, all right? So please keep that in mind. The President's Commission, this is one of the President's Commissions on bioethics back in the early 1980s, writing about this. Death is that moment in which the body's physiological system ceases to constitute an integrated whole. So we're seeing some of that same language here, right? And so how do we do, John Paul II said you can't really determine, you can't measure when the soul leaves the body. So what do we do? And so what the medical scientific community has done is established criteria for determining when someone has died. And essentially, well, for our purposes here, there are two criteria. There's the cardiopulmonary criteria, and there's the neurological criteria. So the cardiopulmonary, again, this is very, very quick on purpose. We could talk more about it in the Q&A if you'd like. The cardiopulmonary criteria basically says death occurs when we're at a point of irreversible cessation of cardiopulmonary function. And here we're talking, obviously, heartbeat, respiration, that. When cardiopulmonary function irreversibly, and that's the key, cease. Oh, that was my ring too. So I thought that was my phone. I was like, ooh. All right, so when cardiopulmonary function irreversibly cease, death has occurred. Then you have the neurological criteria, right? And the neurological criteria basically says, and again, this is very, very quick, neurological criteria for death is when we're at a point of irreversible cessation of all brain function. Now, brain function, we got to understand this in a couple of different ways. Excuse me, not in a couple of different ways. We have to understand a couple of different things. One is what might consider the higher order brain functions, right? Our thinking, our ability to move and do all those other things. And then there's the brain stem, right? And the brain stem, right at essentially the top of your spinal column, the brain stem is what controls physiological function, so your heartbeat, respiration, things like that, right? That's your brain stem. So the neurological criteria says that death occurs when you have irreversible cessation of all brain function, all higher order brain function and brain stem function, right? And some of the indicators, and again, none of these are not complete for the purpose of this, for this presentation. So no brainstem reflexes, no brainstem responses, you can see, motor responses to pain, spontaneous respiration, right? And there are also any, what they would call, I love this term, confounding comorbidity. So sometimes drug overdoses, or let's say someone falls through the ice and they've been, in the ice for an hour and a half. It could appear that they are dead, but in fact they really aren't, all right? So basically for the neurological criteria, all portions of the brain, or all parts of the brain, including the brainstem, have to be dead. I just want to point this out because this is something that is sort of in the news, not sort of, actually is in the news. So the Uniform Determination of, I'm brain dead, Uniform Determination of Death Act. So back in the 1980s, the Uniform Law Commission, which is a group of lawyers, sorry, Jerry, it's made up of a group of lawyers, and what they do is they try to, or they seek to suggest, promote uniform law language. So in other words, say for example, like contract law. You don't want contract law in Pennsylvania to be different from that which is in New Jersey. You want it to be uniform across the country. It makes sense. And so one of the things that the Uniform Law Commission did during the early 1980s is suggest, and I believe all 50 states have adopted, what's called the Uniform Determination of Death Act. And the Uniform Determination of Death Act says this. It's basically a legal definition of death. An individual who has sustained either A, irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions, or B, irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem, is dead. All right? I bring this up because there are efforts underway. They tried and they failed this past summer, but it's going to come up again. There have been efforts to change the Uniform Determination of Death Act. And one of the reasons for doing that is that, okay, well, how do you determine, what's the criteria for determining neurological death? And the American Academy of Neurology has criteria, right? They've got published criteria for how to do this. However, there are some serious questions about whether, and there have been for a while, serious questions about whether the AAN's, that's the American Academy of Neurology, the AAN's criteria is actually, it's sufficient, whether it's sufficient to actually determine brain death. And I'll give you an example of the Jahi McMath case in a second. And so there's this question has been going on. For example, one of the things that the AAN criteria does not test for is hypothalamus function, right? And we'll see in a couple seconds why that might be important. But what has happened over the past couple of years is some uniform law commissioners have tried to, and to put it in layman's terms, lessen the legal standard. So instead of irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, they say permanent cessation of breathing, or permanent coma, or permanent this, or permanent that. And I asked a neurologist, we did a couple podcasts with him, I said, well, what's the difference between irreversible and permanent? And he said, basically, it means this. From medically speaking, if it's irreversible, we can't resuscitate you. If the language is permanent, we won't resuscitate you, right? So there were the Uniform Law Commission. They've been working on this for a couple of years. And they had a meeting in July in Honolulu. Like, you gotta be a lawyer, They meet in, of course, my question is why would you meet in Honolulu in July? I mean, why not meet in January or something, but whatever. But the proposal, and we at the NCBC, we submitted a statement in conjunction with the US Bishops' Pro-Life Committee opposing this proposed change, and they didn't change it. It's the Uniform Law Commission. They want the lawyers want unanimity, and they knew that there was no unanimity on this. Some people supported it, others were very much against it, but it's going to come back. It's gonna come back. But I point this out to you so that there is this legal definition of death that all 50 states have adopted, but there are those who are trying to change that standard. Essentially, our point, the last sentence of our statement was, and this was with a neurologist, he helped us write it. We said, instead of what the Uniform Law Commission should be doing is encouraging the medical community to raise the clinical criteria so that it actually meets this definition, not lessen the definition to meet deficient medical criteria. And so at least for right now, it hasn't been changed. But this is something to keep in mind as we move forward. Evaluation, how does the Catholic Church understand the neurological criteria? And basically go back to John Paul II. And it's interesting because people will interpret his words here in different ways, depending on if you support the brain death criteria or if you don't. Right? And John Paul II says this, it's a well-known fact that for some time, certain scientific approaches, now again, he wrote this in 2000, right? So he's talking like the previous 20 years or so. It's a well-known fact that for some time, certain scientific approaches to ascertaining death have shifted the emphasis, right? So we saw a shift from the traditional cardiopulmonary signs to the so-called neurological criteria. So, previously we had relied mostly on the cardiopulmonary criteria. There was a shift in this, the 80s and 90s to more of an emphasis on the neurological criteria, the whole brain death criteria versus the cardiopulmonary. So that's what he's speaking of here. Here it can be said, and this is the money part of what he says right here. Here it can be said that the criteria adopted, namely the complete and irreversible cessation of all brain activity, if rigorously applied, and that's key. If rigorously applied, in other words, if a doctor takes the American Academy of Neurology guidelines and rigorously applies them, we know that doesn't always happen, but if rigorously applied, it does not seem to conflict with the essential elements of a sound anthropology. All right, so let me read that again. Here it can be said that the criteria adopted, namely the complete and irreversible cessation of all brain activity, if rigorously applied, does not seem to conflict with the essential elements of a sound anthropology. Now, if one supports, or I guess supports the whole brain death criteria for determining death, they will look at this and say, well, St. John Paul II is, saying, it seems to fit. There's not a problem with it. Those who are opposed to it will say, well, that's hardly a ringing endorsement, right? If rigorously applied does not seem to conflict with the essential elements of a sound anthropology. It's not a ringing endorsement, all right? So again, it's the John Paul II's words here, and I've seen it, are going to be used differently depending on how people understand or believe in the whole brain death criteria, right? This is what he said, right? Therefore, a healthcare worker or health worker professionally responsible for ascertaining death, i.e. a neurologist or a doctor who is able to do that, can use these neurological criteria in each individual case as a basis for arriving at the degree of assurance and ethical judgment which moral teaching describes as moral certainty, all right? So John Paul II basically says, if rigorously applied, right, criteria for determining whole brain death can be valid. It can be used, right? But again, notice the language above. It does not seem to conflict with essential elements of a sound anthropology. It's not a full-throated ringing endorsement, all right? But John Paul II is saying, look, it's consistent, right? As I can see it, it seems to be consistent, right? So that's kind of where we are. I'm going to skip the moral certitude part just in the interest of time. Yeah, but now this isn't going to let me do it. Come on. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. All right. What's the NCBC's position as we stand here today? We accept the whole brain criteria for determining death if, and again, this is a big if the criteria is rigorously applied. I was speaking to a doctor, this was a few years ago. I'm not going to tell you where we were, and I'm not going to tell you where this place was. But let's just say it's in a rural part of the country far away from here, right? That I will tell you. He said, well, Joe, I'm in a small clinic around the middle of the sticks, and, we had a guy who was he was a motorcycle accident, came in, and, we didn't have the wherewithal within our facility to be able to do the full American Academy of Neurology criteria. We just didn't have the ability to do that. And I said, oh, well, that's interesting. And I figured, so he said, well, the person didn't go on, he was not a candidate for organ donation. And he goes, oh, no, yeah, he was. I'm like, wait a minute. You're telling me you don't have the ability to test if someone is, for the neurological criteria of death, but the organ procurement organization came in and he was an organ donor. And he's like, yeah. And I said, you don't see a problem with that? If rigorously applied. That's the key. If rigorously applied. All right? Yeah. All right? Question, is the neurological criteria for whole brain death adequate? All right, so a couple of cases. Has anybody ever heard of the Jahi McMath case? Medical professionals do. All right, true story, Jahi McMath. She was a young girl, young African-American girl in Oakland, California, right? So in December of 2013, she went into Oakland Children's Hospital to have her tonsils and I believe adenoids removed. But in the operation, or during the operation, I don't know exactly what happened, but she started bleeding and they couldn't stop the bleeding, right? And you can see things happened, no flow to her brain, everything else. She was declared brain dead, right, in the hospital, right? Her family said, and you can, don't Google her, you can DuckDuckGo her. You can DuckDuckGo her mother, Jahai McMath's mother, in interviews. She disagreed. She said, no, my daughter is not dead. And the doctors all said, your daughter, she's dead. And apparently, famously, the head of the, I think it was the CMO, the chief medical officer of the hospital, in a meeting with the family, slammed his fist down on the desk and said, your daughter is dead, dead, dead. Right? California issued a death certificate for this young girl, right? So legally, she was dead. Now, I don't know the details of how they did this, but in January of 2014, the mother got her transferred to New Jersey. New Jersey and New York are two states that under state law, for religious reasons, and I think it's probably mostly because of the Orthodox Jewish population, but under law, a family can reject a brain death donation on religious grounds, as you can see up here. Right? So she was moved to St. Peter's Hospital in Metuchen, New Jersey, and she remained there. What happened? Right? And there's videos of this. You can DuckDuckGo this, Jahai McMath videos. Over time, some things happened. She matured, she grew, and this is the hypothalamus. All right, this is where the hypothalamus question comes in with the AAN guidelines, which the AAN guidelines don't test for. She grew, she went through puberty, right? She was having her menstrual cycles, everything else. She would move her limbs. There's video of this. Jahai's mother would say, Jahai, move your left hand. And it would take her a few minutes, but she would move her left hand. And they'd be like, do it again. She did it again. Tell her to move her left foot. Jahai, move your left foot. She moves her left foot. She wasn't dead, dead, dead. Right? And those who did declare her dead, the argument was we had six different doctors examined her and declared her brain dead. And the mother says, 6 doctors didn't come in here. They had 1 doctor come in here. And that was it. Basically, what this all comes down to is she was declared dead, but she wasn't dead. And so the question is, do the AAN guidelines, the American Academy of Neurology guidelines, are they sufficient to determine brain death? Now, some will say, yes, they are. They were just badly applied. Well, then, there you go into the, rigorously applied. But it is a question, and the Jahai McMath case raised a huge amount of questions about, not so much is brain death, because there's a couple of different arguments going on. There's some people who will reject brain death as a whole. We don't do that at the NCBC. But there are real questions about the criteria used to determine it. And those are the discussions that are happening right now in terms of what needs to be done. And the Uniform Law Commission didn't do any favors by trying to lower the legal standard. Jahai eventually did die. The question was, Jahai dead or alive? Well, she was obviously alive. She was very obviously alive. Even all those doctors who said she was dead had to say, she's alive. Oops. She was alive. Now, eventually she did die. I forgot exactly what she died from. It was a condition, I'm not sure exactly what it was, but Jahai died in 2018. But real questions about, whoa, wait a minute. How were these criteria applied? And if Jahai can pass through the cracks, have others? And and what does this say about the criteria? And this is why we at the NCBC, we would support a review of the criteria to say, is the criteria used to determine brain death, is it adequate? But that's not our expertise, that's a medical thing. Another interesting case, Marlise Munoz, a woman from Texas, right? Marlise was a 33-year-old woman. She was 14 weeks pregnant at the time. And I guess it was a pulmonary embolism. in November of 2013. A lot of stuff happened in terms of brain death in 2013, or two cases. Jahai was 2013 as well. Developed a pulmonary embolism. She collapsed at her home. By the time they got her to the hospital, she was declared brain dead, right? And from what I understand, there's no question about the determination here. The guidelines were fulfilled to how they were supposed to be. But here's the thing. So remember, she's pregnant. She's 14 weeks pregnant, so she's very pre-viable. I mean, viability today, the edge of viability is 22 some odd weeks, 22 to 24 weeks. And even that, there's many complications and everything else, but she's well before that. The hospital that she was at, her husband wanted her removed from life support, saying that, in their discussions, she said, if I'm ever declared brain dead, I want you to remove life support. And generally speaking, that's not a problem. However, what's the factor involved here? She's pregnant. And in fact, on a lot of living wills, Pennsylvania is included, the living will say that if the woman is pregnant, or I guess now they say if the person is pregnant, that's a whole, I know you guys have already done that one, but this gender thing is ridiculous. But anyway, I could tell you stories about that. Somebody asked me about the Red Cross and my gender. I'll tell you that story, it's a good one. Where were we? Oh, she was pregnant. So if we remove, this is the hospital's perspective, if we remove Marlise from life support, what's going to happen? Her baby's going to die. And according to, oh, by the way, I was saying, you're in Pennsylvania and in other states, in your living will, if you say that if I'm brain dead, remove life support, it actually says in there, if you're pregnant, they will not do it. Right? So it actually does say, that's actually a good thing. But the hospital said, well, Texas law states that we can't do this. Like, she's pregnant, we can't remove life support from her. So the husband went to court, and his argument, or his lawyer's argument, was that, well, the Texas law here doesn't apply because Marlise was already dead. She was declared dead, right? And you can't maintain the life of a person who is legally dead. And the court agreed, right? So the court agreed, and they ruled for the husband. Life support was removed, and both Marlise and her child died. Now, there were some questions, not that this necessarily makes not that this makes a difference. Apparently, there were some questions about, there were some issues with the health of the child and everything else, but regardless of that, both died. But the question here, and there's a lot of questions involved in this, but kind of a head scratcher. If Marlise, after she was declared brain dead, or after she had experienced a pulmonary embolism, and she was declared dead, she was still gestating the child. And other women have done this as well. There's actually a very famous case, almost at the same time, a woman in Vancouver, Canada. Almost the exact same thing, but her husband said, no, maintain life support, and the child was born. I think the child is still living today. But there's a question here, wait a minute, if Marlise is still gestating her child, is she dead or is she alive? And it raises a really, really important question. Anyway, so again, some questions or some cases that challenge the brain death criteria. From the Catholic Church's perspective, organ donation is a great gift. All right, it is a great gift. John Paul II speaks about this. It must first be emphasized that every organ transplant has its source in a decision of great ethical value. The decision to offer without reward a part of one's own body for the health and well-being of another person. Here precisely lies the nobility of the gesture, a gesture which is a genuine act of love. Right? Love here meaning willing the good of the other. Right? So from John Paul's perspective and the Church's perspective, right? Organ donation, if done, rigorous application of brain death or other criteria, it's a great act of love. It's not just a matter of giving away something that belongs to us, but of giving something of ourselves, right? So organ donation can be a great, or it is a great gift for those who offer their organs to others. And I don't know what's going on. Oh, ERD 63. So we're back to our friends, the ethical and religious directives, right? What do the US bishops say about organ donation? And they speak about it in Directive 63. Catholic healthcare institutions should encourage and provide the means whereby those who wish to do so may arrange for the donation of their organs and bodily tissue for ethically legitimate purposes so that they may be used for donation and research after death. Now, obviously, this is with the whole brain death or the cardiopulmonary criteria have been established. The criteria have been rigorously applied, and you can say with moral certitude that the person has died. Right? And probably I'll finish up with this. What are some of the ethical standards in the procurement of organs? We have an obligation to treat a person until death, and then the dead donor rule. We'll just talk about those two very quickly. All right? So basically, in terms of organ donation, and maybe in the Q&A we could talk about the procedures if you wanted to, but basically, all healthcare professionals have an obligation to treat the person until death. Here in the United States, one of the things that means is that you have a separation between the care team and the transplant team. In other countries, that's not always the case, right? So here, some of the obligations that we have, right? So when you have a patient who is a possible organ donor, we have a moral obligation for the care team, right, the hospital, to treat that patient until death is determined. That's your obligation. The ERDs speak about this as well, right? Directive 64. In order to prevent any conflict of interest, the physician who determines death should not be a member of the transplant team, all right? It makes a lot of sense. I heard somebody say that. But again, in some places in the world, like our northern neighbors, that's not the case, right? Healthcare professionals can be part of both. We'll just skip through this one. The last thing just to mention in terms of a moral obligation or moral principles to keep in mind is what was called the dead donor rule, right? Now this is not a real thing, it's more of it's kind of a colloquial term, but it demonstrates some very important ethical considerations. So the dead donor rule, the 3 bullet points you see, basically say the same thing, just in different ways. Right? So the dead donor rule says a patient must be declared dead before organ removal, vital organ removal, heart, that type of thing. The patient cannot be killed for the purpose of organ retrieval. You say, that sounds kind of obvious. China, Canada. In Canada, it is permissible, right? If a patient chooses euthanasia, in other words, they are killed by the medical profession, because that's what euthanasia is, they can be organ donors. And so it is happening, and I've gotten a call from a nurse in Canada saying, I have a patient who's medical aid in dying, they don't call it euthanasia, but has chosen that but wants to be an organ donor. Can I be a part of this? So this stuff is happening. And the removal of the organs cannot cause the patient's death. The ERDs, and this will be the last thing, then we get into a Q&A. ERDs 64 and 62, I just flipped them because I think they make a little bit more sense this way. What do the bishops say about this? Well, ERD Directive 64 says such organs should not be removed until it has been medically determined that the patient is dead. And then 62, the determination of death should be made by the physician or competent medical authority in accordance with responsible and commonly accepted scientific criteria. All right, so I know this was all very quick because it's kind of the end of the day, but basically what does all of this mean? Basically what it means is that the Catholic Church is okay with organ donation, right? As long as death has been properly determined, the criteria used to determine it is rigorously applied, right? And you're doing all of this for ethical purposes, all right? But that doesn't mean that there are not questions. You saw the question about the UDDA, the Uniform Determination of Death Act. There are some new things going on, something called nomothermic regional perfusion, which raise profound ethical questions in terms of organ donation. But as I said, we could talk about that in the Q&A if you wanted to do that.